Hello, today we're going to talk about the difference between weathering and erosion, and then how those two processes change landforms. Now, landforms is one of our vocabulary words for this chapter, which is one of the words that you're going to need to know to help you fill out the paper that you're going to need to complete after this video. Landforms are what we call natural features. Natural features. So what that means is anything like mountains, rivers, valleys, canyons, all those things can be considered landforms. Anything that is on the Earth's surface. Now, today we're going to talk about first weathering. Weathering is when rocks are changed. That's the way we're going to remember it. Weathering is when rocks are changed, and they can be changed by many different ways. How are rocks changed? First way is by wind. A big word that's going to be important that we remember today is sediment. Sediments are simply little tiny particles of rock. And so if you've ever been outside, especially in the desert or just anywhere where it's been dusty and the big windstorm picks up, what you notice is you get hit by all these little dust particles, these little tiny particles of rock. And that's called sediment. And what sediment can do is cause what's called abrasion. Abrasion can best be described as when you take a rough piece of sandpaper and you rub it over a piece of wood, what happens to that wood? Well, that wood changes. It gets smoother. So, wind can change rocks because little sediments, little pieces of rock, are rubbed against a rock, which then changes it, such as when the wind in the desert will be picked up, or the little sediments in the desert will be picked up and constantly beat against that rock. Weathering is a slow process, though, so it's not something we can usually see happening. Another way rocks change is by water. It's the same process with sediments and abrasion, but instead of wind carrying those sediments, water is carrying those sediments. So we've talked about this before. If you head down to a creek bed and you find a rock, typically those rocks are pretty smooth. They're smooth because of weathering. They weren't naturally made that way. Another way that rocks change are by plants. And I remember I asked this question in class: how in the world can plants change a rock? You're telling me a little tiny plant can change a rock. Well, not necessarily a little tiny plant. Let's think of trees. Trees have these really large roots, and what those roots can do is they can find a little crack, and once they get into that crack, when those roots grow, those roots are very powerful, and they can actually crack the rock. When they crack the rock, that's called weathering, because that rock has changed. The same way, that's similar, to how ice works. Ice is the last way that rocks are changed. Ice, when it seeps into rock, can freeze, and you have all seen what happens when when water freezes. It expands, means it gets bigger. So that crack in the rock gets bigger, which is another form of weathering. So rocks are changed 4 ways: by wind, water, plants, and ice. Next, we're going to talk about erosion. Erosion happens when rocks are moved. So weathering was when rocks are changed. Erosion is when rocks are moved. We talked about in class how this could be kind of confusing, because what we're going to talk about is how they're moved can be by the same force. What I mean by that is, let's talk about wind. Wind is one way that rocks can move. I'm not talking about these big boulders. I'm talking about little sediments. Remember, sediments are the tiny pieces of rock, and in a dust storm, or any windstorm, I should say, they will pick up tiny sediments of rock and move them, and that is the process of erosion. Now, during that process, what can happen? Well, those little sediments can run into rock, and what happens is the rock that it runs into then over time will be changed. So a rock can be eroded, moved, but it can also be weathered by the same force. Another one is water. It's the same idea. Think of whenever you've been down to a river. I don't know if you've ever seen a river, but what color is the river? Usually they're kind of a brownish color. And why is that? Because the rivers are flowing. When they're flowing, they're carrying sediments, little pieces of particles of rock. And so wherever those rocks get carried down the stream, that is called erosion when they're being moved. The next one is ice. Now, when we think of ice, I don't think of ice moving. So how does ice cause rocks to move? Well, if you've ever heard the term glacier before, a glacier is a big, slow-moving piece of ice. And many parts of Indiana, especially the northern parts of Indiana, were flattened by the ice, the glaciers. But what they did is they would actually pick up these big boulders and they would move them. They would carry them along. And we're actually planning on doing a science experiment. But if we have time, we'll do it later. But what's really cool is if you have an ice cube tray, if you put some rocks down on the bottom of the ice cube tray and fill it with water and put it in the freezer for it to freeze, what you can do then is you can actually see the process of how rocks are moved. If you put the ice cube on a baking sheet, on a piece of foil, you can actually see when that ice cube starts to melt, it actually starts to slide. And when it slides, it drops some of the rocks along the way. And that is an idea of how rocks can be eroded with ice. Finally, the last one is gravity. I don't know if you've ever seen and been driving through where mountains are. You'll see the signs that says, watch out for falling rock. Well, that's exactly why, because of gravity. Rocks eventually can come loose from many different ways. Maybe ice, maybe wind, maybe water, but when they come loose and they lose the attachment to the wall of a mountain or wall of a cliff, well, then they can fall. And when they fall, the gravity takes over, and that's how rocks are moved. So the last thing we're going to talk about is called deposition. So I'm going to use my best drawing, okay? Let's say this is a rock, and the rock is underwater. Probably should have made that blue, but that's okay. And the rock rolls over to this spot, and let's say it gets stopped there. Deposition is just where a rock is moved to or deposited. So let's say the water carries the rock to its new place. The act of the rock moving is called deposition. So I hope this helps you with your sheet, page 130, that you are going to complete. If you have any questions, please contact me. But again, you can always watch this video again for help. Thanks, and have a good day.